after the referendum. Theresa May fell because her Brexit deal was unacceptable to many Conservatives and was replaced by Boris Johnson to get Brexit done. Then Trussonomics sought to prove the viability of global Britain outside the European Union. But it may be that 2022 and the failure of Trussonomics will inaugurate a period of political stability, following the failure of Brexiteers to chart an alternative course. Some have compared the crisis of 2022 with that of 1992, the last occasion on which a Conservative government found itself thwarted by the financial markets, when on Black Wednesday, Britain left the European exchange rate mechanism. On Black Wednesday, which the Eurosceptics renamed White Wednesday, legitimised Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party and was the first step on the road to Brexit. Now, could the 2022 crisis have an opposite effect of delegitimising Euroscepticism? And Brexit, of course, is yesterday's argument, but there is now a feeling amongst many politicians in both major parties that there should be a closer relationship with the European Union. More important for our purposes, is there not a growing interest in constitutional reform following realisation that out of the European Union, which was a formal constitution in the sense that the treaties limited what government and parliament could do, but out of the EU, we again have an unprotected constitution, which Lord Hailsham famously characterised as an elected dictatorship. And I used to say that the British Constitution could be summed up in 8 words: what the King in Parliament enacts is law. Or it's put in a more picturesque way in Anthony Trollope's novel The Prime Minister, where the Duchess of Omnium says, anything is constitutional or anything is unconstitutional, just as you choose to look at it. And Trollope adds the comment, it was clear that the Duchess had really studied the subject carefully. However, I do now think we can say some things are unconstitutional in the sense of being against constitutional conventions. For example, if the Queen refused to give assent to government legislation, that would be lawful but not constitutional. Now, has Britain still got an unprotected constitution as she had before we entered the European Union? Some years ago I wrote a book called The New British Constitution, emphasising how much had changed, largely as a result of the reforms of the Blair era, though the referendum was of course introduced over 20 years before the beginning of the Blair era in 1975. And I argue that these changes had the effect of limiting the power of government and parliament, not in law necessarily, but in practice. For example, devolution, House of Lords reform, the removal of the vast majority of hereditary peers, primarily Conservatives, made the upper house both more professional and no longer under the control of one party. Indeed, the Lords are now a permanent hung chamber. Directly elected mayor, the first in our history in Greater London in the year 2000, and no fewer than 40% of us in England now live under directly elected mayors, and more are in prospect. The Human Rights Act, a greater role of judges in the Constitution. The judiciary is not mentioned in classic works on the Constitution, such as those by Walter Bagehot or Sidney Lowe, but now any book which failed to discuss them will be inadequate. Now, as has been said before, until 1997, it was assumed that the first past the post system was appropriate for all elections in Britain. But now the devolved bodies in the non-English parts of the UK use proportional representation, so does the London Assembly. Local government in Scotland and Northern Ireland are elected proportionally, and the Local Government and Elections Wales Act of 2021 gives Welsh local authorities the power to institute elections by proportional representation. So first past the post is now guaranteed only for Westminster and local government in England. Now the effect of proportional representation, and I should also mention it was used for European Parliament elections when we The effect of it has not been, as many hoped, to help the Liberal Democrats, but it's helped Nigel Farage. It's accustomed electors to vote for small parties, so that a vote for UKIP no longer appeared as a wasted vote. And the UKIP became, as a result, a threat to David Cameron, prompting him to call for a European Union referendum in 2013. And in 2015, UKIP gained 12% of the vote, though under our electoral system, no seats in Parliament. And Nigel Farage himself has said that without proportional representation, Brexit would not have occurred. Then we have the registration of political parties and the regulation of party funding in the Political Party Elections and Referendums Act of 2000. Parties are no longer as they were at the beginning of the 21st century, voluntary organisations like golf clubs. Now all this, I suggested in my book, entailed the end of what the famous Dicey called the British Constitution a historic constitution. And by that he meant not that it was simply very old, but that it had evolved by a process of adaptation rather than conscious planning. But as a result of the radical reforms that have taken place since 1997, the British Constitution can no longer be characterised in this way. Instead, it offers a spectacle perhaps unique in the democratic world of a country gradually transforming its uncodified constitution in an ad hoc and unplanned way into a codified one, there being neither the political will nor yet sufficient popular consensus to produce such a constitution in one fell swoop. And I argue that the new British Constitution, the 21st century Constitution, if you like, is marked by two central principles. The first being a diffusion of power away from Westminster to devolve bodies like the courts, and the second being, as we have seen, the sovereignty of the people. Both limit the power of government. Now, the Brexit process makes it clear that the referendum is now a firm part of the British Constitution. And that perhaps is remarkable because until 1975, when Britain held her first national referendum, it was widely regarded as unconstitutional. And in 1964, the Standard Work of the British government remarked, "It has occasionally been proposed that a referendum might be held on a particular issue, but the proposals do not appear ever to have been taken seriously." But even though the referendum is now part of our constitution, many Liberals are unhappy about it. Their argument was well put when Britain was considering holding a referendum on Europe in 1974 by Jean Rey, ex-president of the European Commission, who was opposed to a referendum. And he said in London on the 17th of July 1974, "A referendum on this matter consists of consulting people who don't know the problems instead of consulting people who know them. I would deplore a situation in which the policy of this great country should be left to housewives. It should be decided instead by trained and informed people." But of course this line of criticism goes too far. It is an assault on the principle of democracy itself, because it's much easier for a voter to make a decision on a specific issue than to weigh in her mind and balance the host of competing issues on which she has to give a verdict in a general election. So if you think people are not equipped to give a verdict in a general election, in a referendum, it follows a fortiori they're not equipped to make a decision in a general election either. And in the Brexit referendum, that secured a higher turnout than recent general elections. Part of the reason being that in a referendum, by contrast to the first past post-election, every vote counts. And it was noticeable that turnout was much higher in the Leave areas than the Remain areas. 3 of the 4 areas of lowest turnout were London, Scotland and Northern Ireland, which voted Remain. The highest area of turnout was in the North East, which voted Leave, where there are a large number of very safe Labour constituencies on which you may say there's no point voting because your vote can have no influence. In a referendum, every vote has influence, and if turnout had been higher in the Remain areas, the Remain would have got. 1981. Now, some liberals fear that the principle of the sovereignty of the people could prove a threat to liberties, and conservatives are worried that it could lead to mob rule, while Remainers regarded the 2016 referendum as a triumph for the ignorant. All echo the fear of the great French reactionary Joseph de Maistre, who said the principle of the sovereignty of the people is so dangerous that even if it were true, it would be necessary to concede it. But the referendum, far from bringing about mob rule, has proved an instrument of constitutional protection, providing a safeguard against major constitutional changes which the people do not want. It has become the people's veto, and has proved a check less on Parliament than on the party system, and whether or not it is favoured or not will depend on one's view of the efficacy of the party system. And Dicey, the first to propose a referendum in Britain, said it is certain that no man who is really satisfied with the working of our party system will ever look with favour on an institution which aims at correcting the vices of party government. The 1975 referendum in Europe, the first one we had, prefigured the split in the Labour Party in 1981 with the SDP breakaway. The failed 1979 referendum on devolution destroyed the Labour government, and the party went into opposition for 18 years. The 2014 referendum on Scottish independence broke the Conservative and Labour parties in Scotland and heralded a near clean sweep by the SNP in Scotland in the 2015 general election. The 2016 Brexit referendum led to a purge of pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party and destroyed the careers of a whole layer of politicians, the pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party. Conversely, it made the careers both of Brexiteers, such as Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, and of those Remainers prepared after the referendum to support Brexit, such as Theresa May and Liz Truss. In all these cases, it seems as if the standard party system could not cope with problems such as Europe, devolution and independence. It may be, though this is very speculative, that one long-term consequence of this will be an increasing interest in proportional representation. But not only is the principle of a referendum now accepted, so also are the conditions of its use. But some issues, it is suggested, are of such fundamental importance that they cannot be given legitimacy just by Parliament. They also need endorsement by the people. But what are these issues? Can they be defined in a country without a codified constitution? Can there be rules for when referendums should be held? Or does a flexible constitution entail a flexible use of the referendum so that it can be used purely at the discretion of the government of the day, as was the case with President de Gaulle in France? Now, in my view, we have been developing rules in a typically confused, unplanned and ad hoc way. And the most fundamental of the issues on which it is agreed that referendums are required is the secession of a part of the United Kingdom. The Belfast and Good Friday Agreement in 1998 confirmed that Northern Ireland cannot secede without a border poll, while in Scotland, most nationalists have accepted that independence requires a referendum. The second fundamental issue requiring a referendum is a transfer of the legislative powers of Parliament downwards through devolution. And the now irrelevant European Act of 2011 provided that Parliament could not transfer major powers upwards to the European Union without a referendum. And these provisions have a rationale in liberal thought. As John Locke said in his second treatise of government, the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. For it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it to others. Voters, it might be suggested, entrust their MPs with legislative powers, but give them no authority to transfer that power. To do so, they need a specific mandate, which can only be obtained by means of a referendum. The third fundamental issue on which it is agreed that a referendum is required is a change in the electoral system, such as the alternative vote, the subject of the 2011 referendum. For it is obviously desirable to prevent a government from altering the electoral systems of parties and reasons. And it seems to me that acceptance of these issues may perhaps be said to amount to a constitutional convention. And the referendum, therefore, has become a weapon of entrenchment. It prevented the introduction of the alternative vote system and the introduction of regional government unities, while fear of the outcome of a referendum prevented the Blair government from proposing British entry into the Eurozone. The referendum has provided a ballot of fundamental change which the people do not want. It may well be, as Dicey believed, the only constitutional weapon of entrenchment in a country without a codified constitution, and used only rarely, as it is in Britain, supplements but does not replace representative government. Switzerland is the exception, not the exemplar of the use of a referendum. Most democracies use them, but very infrequently. So Brexit is a consequence of a constitutional innovation, the referendums, but it has given rise to what many regard as a constitutional threat, the breakup of the United Kingdom. Brexit, indeed, has raised the issue of the future of the United Kingdom. When Britain entered Europe in 1973, its future seemed assured. Now it is a question mark. The boundaries of Britain date from 100 years ago in 1922 and are contingent. There is no guarantee that they will continue indefinitely, especially as Scotland and Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, and nationalists can argue that they have been pushed out of the European Union against their will. Now, with regard to Northern Ireland, the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement helped achieve a beneficial blurring of identities for as long as both Britain and Ireland remain in the European Union. You could be both British and Irish. But Brexit seems to force a choice, a border, either on the island of Ireland or in the Irish Sea. The Northern Ireland Protocol provides for a border in the Irish Sea. Very interestingly, the courts in Northern Ireland and the Supreme Court have been prepared to consider the validity of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is part of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2020, in the case of Ray Alistair and others' EU exit. The question which the courts had to confront was, did the protocol conflict with the 1801 Act of Union? And if it did, does it matter? Now, the fact that the courts were willing to consider this issue seems to be a further refutation of Dicey's doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, which provides that no person or body is recognised by the law as having a right to override or set aside the legislation of Parliament, because the courts could conceivably have judged the protocol unlawful and in consequence set aside the legislation of Parliament if they'd done so. In fact, they did not do so. They said the protocol was inconsistent with Article 6 of the Act of Union, which provides in effect there should be no customs barriers between Great Britain and Ireland. It ruled the Withdrawal Act impliedly repealed Article 6. That was, in my view, a mistaken judgment. The Act of Union, I believe, is more fundamental than the protocol in that it is constituted of the United Kingdom as a country. It is a foundational statute, and therefore, in my view, it cannot be impliedly repealed nor rendered obsolete by later legislation. If part of the Act of Union is to be repealed, it can, in my view, only be done explicitly, if it can be done at all without the consent of the electors of Northern Ireland. But of course, it does not follow that if the protocol is lawful, it is necessarily constitutional. Because, as I said earlier, it would be lawful for the King to refuse assent to government legislation that would be unconstitutional. And I think there's a further point of interest about the Alistair case. I may be wrong about this, and if I am, I'm sure Alistair will correct me. Because it appears to me the first occasion on which the courts had to decide not between a constitutional and a non-constitutional statute, as in the famous Oberg electric martyrs case, but the first occasion on which the courts had to decide on the priorities between two constitutional statutes. Now, Dicey, of course, believed that Parliament could not legally bind itself, and so Parliament could not be bound by the Act of Union. But in his last book, Thoughts on the Union between England and Scotland, written in collaboration with the Scottish historiographer Royal R.S. Rate, he confronted the conundrum that the Scottish negotiators of the 1707 Treaty of Union certainly did believe that they could preserve certain fundamentals of Scottish law even in the new sovereign Parliament of Great Britain. And Dicey's answer to the conundrum was that while Parliament could not bind itself in law, it could bind itself in honour to preserve certain fundamentals. Now, in consequence of the protocol, Northern Ireland, even after the Windsor Framework, suffers from a democratic deficit, because the storm break in the Windsor Framework refers to amended or new European law, not to existing European Union law. European Union laws passed before Britain left the single market will still apply to Northern Ireland, though of course not to the rest of the United Kingdom. And the European Union also retains power over state aid and VAT in Northern Ireland. While the framework simplifies customs and regulatory formalities between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, these formalities are not abandoned. Manufactures exported from Northern Ireland are required to conform to EU regulations, and the vast majority of manufactures exported from Northern Ireland are, in single quotes, exported in single quotes to the rest of the United Kingdom. And there also remain customs checks, though apparently only around 5% of goods exported, again in single quotes, to Northern Ireland will be physically checked. Now, Rishi Sunak has said that Northern Ireland enjoys the advantage of belonging both to the UK internal market and the EU internal market. But that is the case only as long as they do not diverge. But divergence is, after all, the whole point of Brexit. There's no point in Brexit if you're going to keep to the same rules as you had before. And there is currently a bill before Parliament seeking to fast-track the procedures for altering EU laws. With divergence, Northern Ireland remains, for most practical purposes, in the EU internal market, not the UK internal market, and subject in effect to EU customs rules. So Northern Ireland will be left behind, and Parliament loses the legal power to regulate the entirety of the UK internal market. But the referendum asks whether the UK should leave the European Union, not whether Great Britain should leave the European Union. Now, it is a fundamental constitutional principle that laws should not be passed on taxes levied without accountable representation. And that was why, when in 1909 the House of Lords sought to interfere with the budget, this was held to be unconstitutional because the Lords was not elected. This is the issue of taxation without representation that complained of the American colonists in the 18th century. Now, the storm break in the Windsor Framework may provide Northern Ireland with a veto on EU legislation, but even that is partly debatable. But there is an equivalent to the storm break in Article 102 of the European Economic Area Treaty. And the one attempt to apply the break by Norway in 2011 on the Third Postal Services Directive failed. But even if there is a break, a veto is not the same as consent. Northern Ireland lacks the ability, which other parts of the United Kingdom have, to repeal or amend any European Union law they wish to amend. And all this goes against the provisions of Article 6 of the Act of Union, which provides that in all treaties with foreign powers, the subject of Ireland shall have the same privileges as British subjects. It might be argued that Norway also suffers from regulation without representation, because Norway is not in the European Union, but accepts EU internal market rules. But these rules apply to the whole country and were enacted by the national legislature. For Britain, by contrast, the protocol divides the country, so there is no analogy, because Northern Ireland is not divided into different customs and regulatory areas. The problem of the democratic deficit in Northern Ireland is, in my view, inherent in the protocol, which is, in my view, unconstitutional. Its consequence is that the union with Northern Ireland is damaged, and Westminster does not enjoy full sovereignty in the UK, since it lacks the legal power to regulate the entirety of the United Kingdom's internal market. It is worth pointing out that the fundamental principle of international law is respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of states. And I think the protocol does not respect that ideal. It arises as a result of two constitutional changes, the evolution of Ireland to independence and Brexit. Now, Brexit restores in Ireland a zero-sum game, which the Good Friday Agreement attempted to modify. You are either British or Irish. You can no longer be British and Irish. You are either a unionist or nationalist. The protocol is a victory, temporarily perhaps, for the nationalist side, which has secured soft law on the island of Ireland and a hard border in the Irish Sea. And Irish nationalists can now argue that if Ireland is unified economically, surely it also ought to be unified politically. It may be there's no neutral point from which you can decide which of these viewpoints is right. Brexit perhaps means you have to come down on one side or the other. And your view of the Constitution of Northern Ireland depends on whether you're a nationalist or a unionist. Now, Northern Ireland, if it's joined with Ireland, would automatically rejoin the EU, since it would be joining an existing member state, as East Germany did with West Germany after the fall of communism. Scotland, which also voted against Brexit, would have to negotiate re-entry, which is what the Scottish nationalists favour. It's sometimes forgotten that until 1989, the Scottish National Party was the only party in Scotland advocating that Britain would leave the European Union. And in the 1975 referendum, the worry was the opposite to that in 2016. The worry was that the rest of the United Kingdom would vote yes, but Scotland would vote no. The worry, of course, in 2016 was the rest of the United Kingdom, as happened, would vote no, but Scotland voted yes. So the Scottish National Parties in the opposition were favouring Scotland leaving the rather loosely organised Europe of the 1970s, but remaining in the more tightly integrated one of 50 years later. And the type of Brexit which Britain has negotiated, a hard Brexit, means that Scotland would be faced with a hard border with the rest of the United Kingdom. Scotland is currently represented in Westminster by 59 MPs, 1 in 11 in the Commons, and a good chance of being able to determine the colour of the next British government, as she did during the premierships of Harold Wilson and James Callum in the 1970s. She could be crucial in the next general election. Now, when Scotland was a member of the European Union, contrary to I think what's said before, the European Union was a centralising body, because, for example, in the devolution legislation, agriculture and fisheries are devolved. But that devolution means that 98% of policy on agriculture and fisheries was decided by the European Union. So this means that devolution allows Brexit allows these powers to be returned to the Scottish Parliament. Now, not all the powers are being returned to the Scottish Parliament, and Scots object to that some powers are being retained by Westminster. But under the EU, almost no powers in agriculture and fisheries were devolved to the devolved bodies. But of course, were Scotland to re-enter Europe, agriculture and fisheries would again go back to Brussels. But not only agriculture and fisheries, because the powers of the European Union are not a closed category which can be defined in advance. There is no inherent limit to the powers which the European Union can acquire. COVID, for example, has led to an extension of the European Union's reach with a €750 billion recovery fund, and the European Union is contemplating new economic and fiscal powers to strengthen the euro. It's already a very different body from the one that Britain voted to leave. But the more power the EU acquires, the less power the Scottish Parliament has. And Scotland's control of taxation in the European Union could become less than it has now, but it has in effect power to determine income tax rates. What is left for Scottish voters to decide if, as well as monetary policy, the budget, taxation and economic policy will all transfer to the EU? Now, Scotland would be represented, of course, in European Union decisions. But if the European Union makes a decision the Scots do not like, the Scottish Parliament will be able to do nothing about it. Holyrood would become a mere commentator on EU policies. Nor could Scottish voters do anything about it. Even if they changed their government, it would make no difference. The Scottish people would not be able to say, we do not like what the European Union has decided. We would like a change of policy or a change of government. Now, many Scots believe that their governing principle is not the sovereignty of Parliament, but the sovereignty of the Scottish people. They have a different view of the Constitution, just as the Northern Irish do from the Westminster to the London view. There's an American saying, where you sit depends on where you stand. And the Scottish view of the Constitution is different from the Westminster one. They believe in the sovereignty of people, many Scots do. But returning to the European Union would threaten that principle far more than retaining Scotland's position in the Union. So it seems to me Brexit weakens, in fact, rather than strengthening the case for Scottish independence. Now, devolution, which of course now extends in non-legislative form to England, as well as to the non-English parts of the United Kingdom, raises an acute constitutional problem. But there's a fundamental tension between devolution and the principle of territorial equity, which entails fairness between those living in different parts of the country. So benefits and burdens depend upon the need and ability to pay rather than where one lives. That principle laid the basis of the welfare state as implemented by the Attlee government after 1945. And at Martin Bevan, when he established the National Health Service, pointedly declined devolved powers for Scotland or Wales, even though he himself was Welsh and represented a Welsh constituency. Because health needs, he believed, depended not on where you live, but upon the nature and extent of your illness. Now, of course, central control has not succeeded in achieving greater equality between regions, and there do remain widely different standards of healthcare in different parts of the country. But whether devolution helps to remove or perpetuate these inequalities depends upon the political clout and leverage of local leaders. It is only accidental if their leverage equates with a degree of deprivation in the region. And this means only central government can determine what is the right balance between different parts of the country. But genuine devolution means, as has been seen in Scotland and Wales, a considerable diminution, at the very least, in Westminster's responsibility to transfer public services. It means that when problems arise, voters will cease to complain to the government and ask the government to put it right. And you cannot favour devolution while objecting to a postcode lottery, because with devolution there are bound to be differences between some national authorities and the provision of services. Now, the traditional argument of the right against devolution, used in the past by many conservatives, was that devolution, by undermining the sovereignty of Parliament, would give rise to a slippery slope, threatening the unity of the kingdom. But the traditional argument of the left, used by Vernon, was that devolution would deprive Westminster not so much of sovereignty as of power, the power to correct territorial disparities. Now, if you object to a devolved body supplementing basic provision with, for example, free long-term residential care for the elderly in Scotland, or freedom from prescription charges in the devolved areas. But what are the limits to devolution in national services such as health and education? How much freedom should a devolved body enjoy to depart from national policies in transferred matters? For example, in Scotland, there's a very serious skills problem in education. Now, if there is a problem with skills in education, is that not a problem for the whole United Kingdom, not just for Scotland? Health is one of the devolved functions. Should this mean that a devolved body, if so wished, should be able to charge for a visit to a doctor? In November 2015, Lord Porter, the Conservative chairman of the Local Government Association, warned that devolution of healthcare could mean an end to national standards, in which case it won't be a national service, it will be a range of local services. So the principle of territorial equity is bound to constrain the extent of devolution. But if we are to preserve that principle, we need a clear statement of what functions are so fundamental to the welfare state, so much of a part of the social union, that they are unsuitable for devolution. Because unionism has a social and economic dimension as well as a constitutional one. If devolution is to be compatible with fairness to all the citizens of the United Kingdom, we must be clear about those basic social and economic rights which all citizens of the United Kingdom, wherever they live, are entitled to enjoy. Ideally, a statement of these basic rights should be embodied in the Constitution, defining those powers that need to remain in the centre as embodying the fundamental social and economic, as well as the constitutional and political rights of citizens. But short of that, a charter should be enacted, laying down the basic principles which should govern the territorial division of power between central government and the devolved bodies. Until now, devolution has consisted primarily of responding to pressures from the devolved bodies for further powers. It has been ad hoc and unplanned. But if the United Kingdom is to survive, devolution has to be understood in terms of the needs of the country as a whole, not just the component parts. So if we are to make a success of devolution, we need to lay down clear constitutional principles. And above all, we need to emphasise not only what divides those living in the United Kingdom, but also what unites us, what we have in common. Now, I spoke at the beginning of my talk about the constitutional revolution initiated in large part by the Blair government. But there's a further incipient constitutional revolution occasioned by Brexit, which has withdrawn Britain from a protected constitution, the treaties of the EU, to an unprotected one. Taking back control means for many of its advocates a return to the constitution as it was before 1973, a constitution whose central principles seem to be that of parliamentary sovereignty. But while we were in the European Union, as I said, there was a genuine constitution which limited what government and parliament could do. Westminster, for example, was legally prevented from restricting immigration from the European Union, even though many wanted to do so. While Britain was in the European Union, Parliament was certainly not sovereign. From 2009, Britain was also bound when implementing EU laws by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which was part of the Lisbon Treaty. And this gave British judges the power to do what the Human Rights Act does not allow them to do, namely, to disapply Westminster statutes conflicting with human rights. The Human Rights Act gave judges the power to issue a declaration of incompatibility when they believed that legislation conflicted with rights. But such a declaration is a mere statement without legal effect. The presumption is that Parliament will duly amend the law, and it has generally done so. But the rights of minorities, sometimes unpopular minorities, should not, many would argue, depend on majority opinion in common. Now, in the Ben-Harbouch case in 2017, as important in my view as the famous Factor case, the Supreme Court, using the Charter, disapplied for the first time in British history part of the statute, the State Immunity Act of 1978, because it conflicted with rights, the rights of Ms. Ben-Harbouch, an employee at the Sudanese embassy. Now, almost the whole of EU law has now been incorporated into British law, so that government and Parliament can decide which to retain, which to modify, and which to repeal. But the Charter is not incorporated, even though its rights are of great importance. For example, the Article 21 right to non-discrimination on grounds such as sex, race, colour, ethnic or social origin, genetic features, language, religion or belief, political or any other opinion, membership of a national minority, property, birth, disability, age or sexual orientation, which, unlike the European Convention, gives specific protection to the LGBTQ community. Which also, for example, the Article 24 rights of the child, giving access to the United Nations Convention, which Britain has ratified but not incorporated into domestic law. So the rights we previously enjoyed are now at the mercy of government and Parliament. And Andrew Langdon QC, as chair of the Bar Council, lamented in September 2017 that rights are not being brought home, they are being abolished. What is clear is that Brexit both disentrenches the British Constitution and removes Britain from a human rights regime, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. It is rare, if not unprecedented in a democracy, to exit from a major international human rights regime, and no democracy, to my knowledge, has hitherto moved from a protected to an unprotected constitution. Now, other member states of the European Union continue, of course, to be bound by the Charter, while countries such as the United States and Canada have their own provisions protecting human rights against the majority of the legislature. It is perhaps worth asking a very undician question. Are British MPs so much more sensitive to human rights than legislators in other democracies that they can safely be entrusted with their protection? And I leave the answer to that question for you. Now, Brexit and the parliamentary battles we enacted have increased uncertainty as to what our constitution actually is, and in particular what the conventions of the constitution are, and to what extent they bind. At the beginning of the 20th century, Sidney Lowe, in his book The Government of England, said the constitution was based not on codified rules, but on tacit understandings, although, as he ruefully remarked, the understandings are not always understood. Perhaps these understandings are now even less well understood, and the activities of Boris Johnson and others have led to commentators such as Peter Hennessy to declare that the good chaps theory of government no longer holds. And we remain one of three democracies without a codified constitution. The others are New Zealand, a relatively homogeneous society, with a population just over half that of Greater London, and Israel, although in Israel statutes contribute to basic rights can at the moment be declared invalid by the Supreme Court, though this power is now under attack by the right-wing government of Israel. And it's perhaps ironic that those who are campaigning against this proposed change, removing the power of Israel's Supreme Court to declare a statute convening human rights invalid, argue that it would make Israel undemocratic, even though Israel's constitution would then resemble that which we have in Britain. Now, Brexit, by revealing our nakedness, might have been expected to be our constitutional moment, leading to progress towards the constitution. But the Conservatives are not interested. Indeed, they seek to tamper even with the limited protections offered by the Human Rights Act. Odd for a party, one of whose principles is protection of the citizens against arbitrary government. Labour's last Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, was widely believed to have favoured, had he been returned to power in 2010, a constitution to coincide with the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta in 2015. The recent report of the Commission on the Future of the UK, which he chaired, proposed that devolution be constitutionally entrenched. But even before Brexit in 2015, the late Lord Bingham, regarded by many as the greatest judge of his generation, declared that constitutionally speaking, we now find ourselves in a trackless desert without any map or compass. It is surely time for us to end our constitutional isolation. But let me conclude by reverting to the question posed by the Constitution Society of crisis in democracy and try and answer it, and perhaps inject a spirit of optimism into this conference, which, like other Constitution Society conferences, tend to encourage an atmosphere of gloom. But let me end on those optimism. 2022 seems at first sight a year of democratic crisis, the year of 3 prime ministers. A friend of mine told me his son had lived through 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors, and 3 home secretaries, one of whom was home secretary twice. His son is only 6 months old. But in fact, you can argue that 2022 shows how stable Britain remains, perhaps the most stable amongst the larger states of Europe, despite Brexit and despite Boris Johnson. Because you can argue that 2022 was a year in which our constitution, effectively it may be, actually worked. Boris Johnson announced his resignation. Belatedly, it's true, but only by around 24 hours. He did not, as some feared, seek a snap general election from the Queen. He did not, as some feared, simply walk away and leave immediately. He acted responsibly, remaining until a new leader had arrived. Following the choice of Liz Truss as Conservative leader and Prime Minister, Conservative MPs came rapidly to the conclusion they made a mistake. She was removed rapidly, efficiently, and without fuss or riots. Presidential systems such as those of America and France cannot remove unsatisfactory leaders except through riots or impeachment, which is a clumsy method, confusing the political and the juridical. Nor is it easy for the coalitional systems on the continent to remove unsatisfactory leaders, since that often means untying a coalition agreement. In 2022, when people fail, institutions work. And it's worth saying, in view of the view held by some, that Brexit would make us more insular than racist, that of the 8 candidates for the succession to Boris Johnson, 4 came from ethnic minorities and 4 were female. There were 3 others who hoped to stand but could not attract sufficient support. 3 were from ethnic minorities, including one who was Jewish. 3 of the top 4 posts in the Truss and Sunak governments are held by non-whites. A French friend of mine was astonished, said it would never happen in France. Angela Merkel's last cabinet in 2017 was 100% white. Americans talk a great deal about diversity. Britain practiced it. What happened in 2022 illustrates an important point about democratic government, that democracies at their best have a self-correcting mechanism. Autocracies as Russia, China and Iran show do not. 2022 was not only the year of 3 prime ministers, it was also the year of war with Ukraine and Chinese threats to Taiwan. And 2022 has shown in very graphic form the advantages of democratic government and the limitations of non-democratic alternatives. Russia has been shown to be inefficient and incompetent. There have been popular riots in China and in Iran. Recently, we've heard a great deal about the erosion of support for democracy, especially amongst the young. But the alternatives in Russia, China or Iran do not now seem quite as attractive as once they may have seemed. The riots in Iran and China and Russian failure in Ukraine show that so-called strongmen can prove in fact to be very weak. But democracies can self-correct. That is their great strength. And this occurs in large part through vibrant scrutiny and criticism in Parliament and press. There is no need in democracies for riots, violent protest or regime change. There are, of course, many things wrong with our democracy, but we should not exaggerate our problems, nor think that there was once a golden age. Harold Lasky wrote in one of his books that he had a conversation in 1923 with John Morley, a Liberal leader, and Margaret Gladstone, and said that the role of the private member had weakened considerably in his lifetime. And John Morley said, "It's very interesting you say that. I said exactly the same to Mr. Gladstone in 1880, that the role of the private member was nothing compared with what he'd been." And Mr. Gladstone agreed. So the private member had really not had any real genuine interest in power since before the Great Reform Act of 1892. So we should not exaggerate the merits of the past and a golden age. And let me end on I don't believe, as one previous speaker said, that we're living in a stage of permanent crisis. And let me end on a note of optimism with the wise words of the great economist Adam Smith. When Britain lost the American colonies, a young aristocrat told Adam Smith, "This will be the ruin of the nation." Young man Smith replied, "There is a great deal of ruin.